Good evening and welcome to the History and Genealogy virtual classroom. Today is Thursday, November 12th, and the time is 6:35 p.m. Thank you for joining us. My name is Scott Hall, and I will be moderating this Zoom session. Today's class, Tracing Your African American Ancestors, Digging Deeper, will be taught by Dan Lillienkamp. This class will be recorded and made available on the St. Louis County Library website and on the library's YouTube channel. If you are viewing this Zoom webinar live, you are encouraged to type questions using the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. The instructor will answer questions at the end of this session. I've put a link to the class handout in the chat. I will now turn this over to Dan and we will begin the class.
Good evening and welcome. As Scott said, my name is Dan Lillienkamp, and I'm a reference specialist here at History and Genealogy, and I will be conducting this program tonight. So, Tracing Your African American Ancestors, Digging Deeper. So, okay, we're going to be a couple of parts. The first, we're going to look at some more easily accessible records, things like census records, birth records, marriage records, military records, land records, newspapers, and death-related records. And of course, we'll start with census records. The federal government has taken a census every 10 years beginning in 1790. The most recently released one is 1940. They're kept private for 72 years just to ensure people's privacy so that they can answer honestly and truthfully. So we have to start when we're doing census research with the 1940 and then work back to 1930, 1920, 1910, 1900. Then we had 1890, which is a lost census. It was in a building, the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C. It caught on fire, and the census was destroyed when they put the fire out, and the water turned it into a mess of pulp. And they didn't know what to do with it, so they just discarded it. Then 1880, 1870, which is a very important census for African American researchers because this is the first one, the first post-emancipation census. It's the first time every African American in the country will be listed by his or her full name, or maybe even a name at all. Then we can go back to 1860, 1850, 40, 30, 20, 10, 1800, and finally back to 1790. And if you have free ancestors, they might well be on any of these. And really, to learn more about the census, we offer a class, Finding Ancestors in U.S. Census Records. We have a version of that that's been loaded on our webpage and on our YouTube channel, so you can check that out. Now, another part of the census that can be important for African Americans is the slave schedules. The Constitution provided that enslaved people would be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of a congressional representation. Some people find that kind of disrespectful, that your ancestors only counted as 3/5 of a person, but the reality is it would have probably been better if they counted as 0%, because basically it was a tool to enhance the power of the slave owners in the federal government. In 1850 and 1860, they kept separate schedules for this, and typically what they look like was this. They have the name of the slave owners, the number of slaves, their age, and their gender, and their color, and no other individually identifying people. Sometimes, depending on the number of enslaved people a particular slave owner possessed, it might be possible to identify individuals based on their ages and their genders, but generally this is not the most useful record that we could possibly come up with, unfortunately. However, they didn't always do it right. I mean, here's an example from Bowie County, Texas, and another one from Utah County and Deseret. And if you look in both of these, they do list the name of the slave owners and the number of slaves and the age and the gender and the color, but they also list the first name of all the enslaved people. And you know, sometimes the census takers don't do things right, and that's always usually a good thing for us because it usually means they give too much information. We know these two exist. Are there any more out there in 1850? I have no idea. If you come across one, I'd love to know about it. But these are the ones I know about. The same thing happened in Boyd County, Kentucky in 1860. They gave the name of the slave owner and the number of slaves and the ages and the gender and the color like they were supposed to, but they also gave the first names. Again, are there others in 1860? I don't know. But I just take it as a gift when we get this kind of information that we're not supposed to get. Another schedule that people should become familiar with is the mortality schedule. They didn't issue one of these every year, but they did in 1850. This is an example from Beaufort County, South Carolina. And if you look, it gives the names of individuals and their age. This would be the age when they died, their gender, their color, whether or not they were slave or free. So enslaved people show up on this. Marital status, place of birth, month of death, the occupation, and cause of death, and the number of days they were ill. So if you have an ancestor that died in the year preceding the census, so basically from the at the date of the census back 1 year, they very well could be on this, whether they were enslaved or whether they were free. And you can provide information, you find information out about them that you might not otherwise have found, because most states didn't begin issuing death certificates anywhere close to this time frame. There's also a veteran schedule from 1890. The 1890 census, of course, no longer exists, but the veteran schedule does, at least for some of the states. Let's look at this. This is the name of the men who served. Generally, they served during the Civil War. Their rank, company, the regiment, enlistment, discharge, length of service, the post office address, whether or not they were disabled, and then other remarks. And there are African American soldiers whose names appear on here. And if you find an ancestor on here, it will be a good clue to look for them in other military records. Well, this is a census 1880, I believe. It's from somewhere in Alabama, I don't remember where. And if you notice, we have this man, Dennis Robbins, who was a black male, age 60. But what we care about here is this says he's a farmer. If your ancestors worked in agriculture and were a farmer, they might very well show up on the agricultural census. And this is what that looks like. And what kinds of questions do they ask? Well, let's find Dennis Robbins here. And it asks whether they own the property or they rent it or if they're a sharecropper. So if you're a sharecropper, you still end up on the agricultural census. That's good information to know. It says he farmed 16 acres. He had $55 worth of livestock, or is it 35? I can't tell. The number's right underneath. $125 of produce produced. Go down to the next line. He had 2 milk cows, 1 other cow, and 1 calf was born during the past year. They made 30 pounds of butter. They had 1 pig. They had 10 barnyard poultry. They had 2 other poultry, and I have no idea what that is. Egg production, they got 10 dozen eggs over the course of the year. And as we continue, it's got 3 acres in corn, and it produced 20 bushels. Grew 2 bales of cotton. They made 7 gallons of molasses and 4 bushels of cowpeas. That'd be black-eyed peas. And there's just all kinds of other crops. Obviously, it depends on where you live. You're going to grow some crops and not others. If you live in New England, you're probably not going to grow cotton. If you live in Texas, you're probably going to have a lot more cattle than anything else. Now let's consider birth records. We all want to find a birth certificate for our ancestors, and sometimes that's possible. But in many cases, births and deaths registrations didn't start as early as we think they did. In fact, if we look in the Southeast, which is the area most African-American families are going to come from, we're going to see probably the earliest is Texas, starting in 1903. Georgia's probably the latest at 1919, but that's kind of a bracket of the time frame that most southern states started recording births. So if you're looking for somebody that was born in 1907 in Georgia, they're not going to have a birth certificate. However, once Social Security became a thing, most states started issuing a delayed birth certificate because you needed a birth certificate to apply for your Social Security card. And so people would go into the office with some kind of proof of when they were born. It could be an older sibling or a parent saying, this is when they were born. I remember it. There could be something else, a notice from maybe a church program that, or maybe a school record that said when they were born or how old they were in a particular year. And so then these delayed birth registers, birth certificates are issued. And you can typically get these the same way you would get a birth certificate from the state. If your family came from Arkansas, there's this whole series of books, Arkansas Prior Birth Index. And basically, when you look inside it, it's just a list of names alphabetically of people who registered during, in this case, 1942. They registered their birth. They were born long before that. It lists their names, what county, mother's name, and other information to help you find the actual certificate. Now, a few states did things a little early. Kentucky had birth registers as early as the 1850s. They discontinued them and then started it up again. And they recorded the births of everybody. I mean, in this case, we've got a child named Washington, who's male, born in Gallatin County. Slave owner's just initial was JP. Mother's name was Jane, and he was black. And then in this other one, we've got a Joe, who was born in Eagle Creek. The father was the slave owner was A.P. Roselle. There is no mother named in the record, but it says he was black. Virginia also kept records of births beginning in 1853. If your people come from Virginia, this is another set of records that could give you birth information. And it's pretty straightforward. It gives the informant's name, which is probably the slave owner, the name of the enslaved child, the mother's name, the date of birth, and the place of birth. And these are just listed alphabetically. Church records is another place you might find birth records. This is from Southwest Louisiana, Roman Catholic area. In this case, We have this record, basically translated. It's Alexandra, a male Negro child, son of Claudine, who was also a free black woman, who was baptized on the 20th of July at the age of 1 year. So if he was 1 year old, we can probably come pretty close to his birthday. And listed the baptismal sponsors, and it says what church that came from, in this case, St. Martin of Tours in St. Martinville. Now, interestingly, right above him is another one. And this is another Alexander. This is the slave of Mr. Greveber. His mother was Rose, who was also a slave of Mr. Greveber, and he was baptized on the 1st of December, 1776. And the sponsors were Louis Greveber and Genevieve Robichaud. And this was, he was a Capuchin monk in Opelousas during the absence of the priests at St. Joseph's Parish. So you could definitely get the original record if this were your ancestor. I want to look at some marriage records now, because this is another source of information. Most states have kept marriage records for a while. Usually it's one of the earliest things they start recording. And here's examples from Callaway County, Missouri, and Jackson County, Missouri. Sometimes they kept African Americans in a separate book from the European descended people. Sometimes they didn't. Another source of marriage records is the Freedmen's Bureau. After the Civil War, when the Freedmen's Bureau was set up, one of the things they did was solemnize slave marriages. Enslaved couples were often, married by the slave owner in some sort of ceremony on the property, but it wasn't a legal marriage because enslaved people were not allowed to be legally married. But the slave owners generally permitted something, and instead of promising till death do you part, it was till death or separation do you part, because it's entirely possible they could have been sold away from each other. Military records. I mentioned this with the veterans schedule, but this is another source of information. And remember, African Americans have participated in every war fought by this country from the Revolutionary War all the way up through the present. So there's a really good chance that you have a veteran in your ancestry, probably more than one, and you want to look for their military records. Now, this is a compiled service record from the U.S. colored troops. They had artillery, cavalry, and infantry, and this basically was a periodic report of where the person was and what they were doing. Now, if your ancestor enlisted in Missouri or Maryland or Kentucky or Delaware or West Virginia, you might find one of these. This is the descriptive recruitment list of a volunteer. So they didn't make a picture of the person when they volunteered. They tried to make a description of what the person looked like, who they were, where they came from. Why did they do that from these particular states? Because there was a program that if a slave owner allowed one of their enslaved people to enlist in the army, two things would happen. The person would be free after the war, and the slave owner would be compensated $300. The reality is that didn't happen. Nobody got compensated. It was an attempt to keep the slave owners in the loyal states relatively calm and to still recruit soldiers from the enslaved population. And it did a great job on that regard. And certainly the promise of freedom was a great benefit for people to sign up. So what kind of information? We get the full name of the recruit. We get the name of the slave owner. the slave owner's county and state, the recruit's birthplace, how about that? And the special remarks, which could be just a gold mine of information, or it could be nothing, or they could have just left it blank. But if you're lucky, there'll be something written there, and it'll be beneficial for you to read. And if you want to learn more about military records, we offer a course, Discovering Ancestral Military Veterans, and I believe there's a version of this on our website right now, or on the YouTube channel. I want to look at land records now. People say, well, we never owned any land. Are you sure? Quite a number of African Americans did in fact own land, particularly post-emancipation. This is a picture from Nebraska. We're going to look at the John W. Shore's household. And there they are. In Nebraska, and if we look on the History Geo, which is shows the first landowners in the country, we can find where their land was, and each one of those squares is 40 acres. So he owned 40 acres, moved out there, was one of the exodusters, obviously, lived in one of the sod houses out on the prairie and farmed as a free man. And we can also get a copy of this, which is the original land patent. This indicates he was absolutely the first landowner in this of this particular piece of land, and he basically homesteaded it, made the necessary improvements, and got the land from the federal government. Newspapers are an extremely underutilized resource for information. I just love looking at newspapers, and they've become so much easier now that we have a bunch of newspaper databases. If you were here last week, you saw this example already from Ocala, Florida. This is about Venus, who was the oldest person in her section. And it says, from Columbus, Georgia, Venus Wardlow, a Negro woman, 115 years of age, died at the Schley plantation in Chattahoochee County a day or two ago. She was the oldest person in this section of the state. In slavery time, she was the property of the late W.J. McBride, who bought her in Charleston in 1828. That's fantastic information. It gives the name of the original slave owner, that she was from South Carolina, where she lived at the end, that she was in Chattahoochee County, just remarkable information. Another newspaper site that we need to be aware of is this one called Last Seen. It's called Finding Family After Slavery. And if you go to the website, there's a search bar, and you can put in a last name. In this case, I just put in the name East. And I'm going to click that magnifying glass to search, and I'm going to get a lot of East family listings. And so I'm just going to pick the top one. I don't know who any of these people are. Just pick the top one. And I come to a page on Ben and Flora East, and it gives me some information that George and Flora East are looking for their children, Polly and George Washington. The ad was run in the Colored Tennessean, which was a newspaper from Nashville, Tennessee. And the ad ran on the 7th of October, 1865. And if we scroll down the page, we'll get more information. This is a transcript of what the ad says. So offering a $200 reward. This is during the year 1849, Thomas Sample carried away from this city all his slaves, our daughter Polly and our son George Washington, to the state of Mississippi and subsequently to Texas. And when last heard from, they were in, they couldn't read the writing, Texas. We'll give $100 each for them to any person who will assist them or either of them to get to Nashville or get word to us of their whereabouts if they are alive. Any information concerning them left in this city at our place so that we can get it will be liberally rewarded. Ben East and Flora East. So basically, they're looking for two of their children that have been sold away from them. They put the ad in the paper. These newspapers generally were read out in churches all across the country, African American churches, by the pastor at the end of the service, so people could, maybe connect up with their relatives. Finding family after slavery was one of the most important things for people to do, since they had been separated for a very long time potentially. So anyway, if we scroll down the page, we got some more information. In this case, we get this little tiny copy of the ad itself, and we can print it out. And if we look at it, we can see there where it says that word that they couldn't read. Well, it looks to me like it's LaGrange. There is a LaGrange, Texas. So I'm thinking that's where they were last heard of. So I got curious, were they successful? And I found the East family in 1870 census. And at that point, living with him was George W., age 21 at school. So at least they found him if they didn't find Polly. So, good news came from this ad. Do they all have good news? Probably not. But it's interesting to look at them. It's kind of heart-rending to look at them. But, there are some success stories from them. Another website that's substantially similar is Lost Friends. This is from the Historic New Orleans collection, and it's newspapers that they have. And that's their webpage. I believe it's on the handout. Another thing to consider when you're looking at newspapers, I heard a talk about this several years ago at a conference, and I've not heard anything on the update of this project, but there was a group getting together the student newspapers from the historically Black colleges and universities. And the reason for that is there's so much information about families and about the students. And a lot of people hear that and they're like, well, nobody in my family went to college. And in response to that, someone actually asked that in the conference that I was at when the woman was talking about it. And she said, are you sure? Because remember, some of these schools back then were not necessarily what we would consider a college today. They might have been a trade school. They might have been an agricultural school. In some cases, they were teachers' colleges. But the estimate is at least 1 in 10 African-American families will have an ancestor that attended one of these. If you can find the newspapers from the schools, you could find all kinds of information about them. Other places to find newspapers is we have got a number of databases here at St. Louis County Library that you can access with your library card. The Post-Dispatch from ProQuest just is the Post-Dispatch, but it's our local paper. We've got 19th century U.S. newspapers. We've got Newspaper Archive, and the new big one that we've got is newspapers.com. And I've got newspapers from all over the country, and the wonderful thing about them, all of these, is you can do a quick search because you just put in the name, and if the OCR is working properly, it'll pop up a bunch of hits for you. And if you want to learn more, we have a class, History and Genealogy in Newspapers. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about death-related records. Different places keep their records differently. We have a microfilm set of Orleans Parish, Louisiana. It's just an index of deaths, but it gives the name and the age and the gender and the color and the date of death and the volume and page number in the actual record. So you could contact Orleans Parish and get a copy of it if your people were from there. It goes all the way back to 1804. State of Louisiana also has one, same type of information, But for the whole state of Louisiana, they didn't start it until 1900. Mississippi's got the same thing. If your people are from Mississippi, we've got it from 1912 to 1943. Again, it doesn't go back very far, but Mississippi didn't start death certificates until about then. Gives the name, the county, the race, the certificate number, and the last 2 digits of the year. If you find your person in this index, you can contact the Mississippi State Archives and get a copy of the record. If your people came from Missouri, on Missouri Digital Heritage, we have this wonderful death certificate website. You can put in the name and you can search, and it's searchable fully from 1910 when death certificates started up through, well, this shows 1966, but actually it's 1967 now. Actually, it's 1969 now because after 50 years, they make them public. So 1970 deaths will be available sometime in the spring of 2021. I don't know how that's going to work because we've got a pandemic going on right now, and that might slow down their indexing and scanning, but we'll see. Sometime next year they should be up. You can also, if you're looking for death information, look for cemetery records. Here at History and Genealogy, we've got the records for Washington Park Cemetery. We've got these individual cards that says when they died, when they were buried, what lot they're in. Got similar records from Father Dixon's Cemetery. We do not have in our collection the records from Greenwood Cemetery, but if you contacted them through their Facebook page or their website, they can help you if you've got people buried there. But these Father Dixon records gives the date of death, the date of interment, the name of the deceased, the place of death, their gender, their marital status, where their grave is, the cause of death, which has been blanked out of these records, their age, the lot and block section, the registration number, and the name of the undertaker. If you know the name of the undertaker and the undertaker's still in business, they might have records that they can help you with too. Don't go visit them on Monday. That's their busiest day. Another place for death records is church records. I mean, in this case, it is the burial of colored people from the Catholic Church of Mobile, Alabama. In this case, we've got a date of 18 May, 1834. Jane, about 30 years old, a slave of Mr. Albert. I mentioned funeral home records before. If your family's patronized the same funeral home for a number of years, they'll probably be inclined to help you out. Even if they're not, they might let your records be available for you to look in to find out about your family. Again, don't contact them at their busiest day and their busiest time. Other places to find information about deaths are online. Find a Grave is probably the largest free website of cemetery information. This is all done by volunteers. You can search it by name. You can narrow it down by state and county. And, it'll give you the information either usually it's off the information off the stone, but sometimes they put other information too if they know it. Like other members of the family buried in the same plot, maybe a spouse if they're buried at the same plot or have the same headstone. Sometimes there's pictures of the stone. Sometimes there's pictures of the people. It just is what the volunteer could come up with when they put the thing together. Billion Graves is similar. It's free registration. These are both free to use. Different cemeteries are on different ones, again, because different volunteers put information on different sites. Is the same information on both of them sometimes? Probably. But so what? Look at them both. Now I want to take an example and look through using some of these records. So this isn't just all up in the air stuff. So I want to look at the Brandon family of Alabama. And this is what I know going in. And that's that the youngest, well, not the youngest person, obviously, but there's a Laura Brandon who was born on March 1888 in Alabama. She got married to Al Douglas on the 20th of March, 1906 in Jackson County, Alabama, and died on the 30th of April, 1984, probably in Madison County, Alabama. And through the magic of family tree on Ancestry, I was able to find these pictures of her. Somebody else had put up a tree about her, and these pictures were here. The person I was helping with this had never seen these pictures before. So it was a great find for them. So check the family trees on Ancestry. Don't necessarily believe what they tell you, but check because you might find other things like these pictures. Well, her father was Joe Brandon, and her mother was Katie Allison. There's a picture of them too, same source, tree on Ancestry. Well, I want to look for some information about them, so I'm going to go to Family Search. Family Search is a free website. You need to either sign into it if you've got an account. If you don't have an account, make one. It's free. And we're going to go search. And I'm going to search the catalog. And I'm going to search for a place, Madison County, Alabama. And these are all the records that they've got available from that county. And I'm going to go way down to the bottom and look at the vital records. Vital records are births, marriages, and deaths. This is all the vital records from that county. And I'm going to look at this, marriage records 1809 to 1951. And so I click on that and I get to this page and I can scroll down and I can see what's available in what format. So if you see the little camera, it means it's digitized. It means I can look at the original records right there. If I see this little thing that looks like a movie film, that means it's on microfilm and it hasn't been digitized. Check back, they may digitize it in the future, but right now it's not been digitized. Which basically means you're going to have to go to Salt Lake City to look at it. And finally, whether it's digitized or microfilmed, there might be this little magnifying glass. And that means there's an index for that bit of information, which means it's easier to search. You don't have to just go page by page. So I'm going to go in here and look. This is what it looks like. This whole roll of film has been digitized and you're literally having to go page by page. And I just did that. And I looked through this, excuse me, and I found this marriage record for them. And so that's where I got this information that they were married on the 18th of November, 1873 in Madison County, Alabama. Well, what about the death? Well, they didn't have a death register listed there, but they've got records. Let's just do a sort and see. We'll search the U.S., find Alabama. What do we got? Alabama deaths, 1908 to 1975. Excuse me, 74. And so I did a search, and there's this index for Joe Brandon. So I'm going to click on it and see what it takes me. Well, it's going to take me to this page that's got the information from the death certificate, but it doesn't have a copy of the death certificate. In fact, if you look there to the right, it says no image is available. So we're stuck looking at that, or are we? Well, it turns out there's this other little thing over here that says view. So what happens if I click that? Well, I get the same information, but this time it's got an image with it. Why is it like that? because a whole bunch of people are doing a whole bunch of work really fast on family search, and sometimes the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. So always dig a little deeper, because you might find something that you're immediately not aware was there. In fact, it might even say it doesn't exist. So if we click on this record, it comes up. It's not the prettiest record that I've ever seen, but it gives a lot of information. It gives the information of his parents, his birth date, his death date, where he's buried, all this information that's always on a death certificate. Okay, well, what about Katie's information? She died, from what I've learned, in 1895. How did I learn that? Obviously, it wasn't from a death certificate, because Alabama didn't issue death certificates then. It wasn't from family search, because they don't have Alabama deaths that early. So where do I get this information? Where did I get it? Well, I went to Newspaper Archive. And I found in there that they have the Huntsville Journal from Huntsville, Alabama. And so on the 9th of May, 1985, I did a search for the name Brandon, and I came across with this. And it's a death notice published in the paper. And it's Brandon in this county, Tuesday, the 28th of April, 1895. Mrs. Kate Brandon, wife of Mr. Joe W. Brandon. She bore her long and painful sickness with Christian fortitude and passed over the river, trusting her master. So we know she was sick for a long time, and it was a difficult illness, but she was a strong woman, and she just dealt with it, and she finally died on the 28th of April. But since I just put in the name Brandon, I got all kinds of hits from this paper. I found Marvelina Brandon. Well, who's that? I don't know. Do now. Received a letter from our friend Joseph W. Brandon of Poplar Ridge this week, notifying us of the death of his daughter, Miss Marvelina, who is budding into womanhood. Found a Carrie Brandon. Same story. In her 16th year, she was the daughter of our worthy citizen, Mr. Joe W. Brandon of Poplar Ridge. Mary Eliza Brandon, Huntsville Journal, May 27th, 1897. Again, she died, daughter of Mr. Joe W. Brandon. Then I found this article too, Republican Executive Committee, Huntsville Journal. So Joe Brandon was prominent enough that he was elected to the Republican County Committee for the state. Now I want to look at some more complex sources. These are difficult to get into, so I want to look at them after we covered some of the easier ones. And we'll start with Reconstruction Records. One of the first ones that you need to look at is the field office of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. This is the Freedmen's Bureau. Well, what was the job of the Freedmen's Bureau after the war? It was to provide food, clothing, education, temporary camps, hospitals, legal marriages, to try to reunite families, to provide transportation to people who are trying to hook up with their family that they've been sold away from, indentures for work, legal representation, employment, labor contracts, dealing with abandoned lands and confiscated property, and they were supposed to provide veteran services. And there's records for all of this. I already mentioned the possibility of them solemnizing a marriage. But what about employment? This is an index to the Mississippi Freedmen's Bureau labor contracts. And this points us to a microfilm set M826 on roll 43 and gives us a contract number. Well, I'm going to go look at that contract, and there it is. It's a contract between John Brister of Yazoo County, Mississippi, and this is the people that he contracted with. Now, the same names are listed there. Here it is written out. Certainly, it's easier to look at the typed index, but this is the real thing on the right. Another source of information from this time period is the Freedmen's Bank. Freedmen's Bank was set up so that the newly freed African Americans would have a safe place to put their earnings, because they were going to get paid for working now, and they needed a place to keep their money. Unfortunately, the bank was run ultimately by some fairly dishonest people, and a lot of people lost their money. And this created a distrust of banks by many members of the African American community that lasts up into this day. Some people lost everything, some people lost part of it, some people got all their money back. But it left us with these records, and it's worth looking at. Here's the name of the account holder, Richard Lanston. It gives the place of birth of Madison County, Alabama. He was 30 years old. His father was James and his mother was Letty. And he had brothers and sisters, Harry, Shadrach, James, Thomas, Lawrence, Sarah, Alice, Martha, Maria, and Leah. Now let's look into some antebellum records, because as you push your way back, you're going to look into the period before the Civil War, and you're going to need to know the name of the slave owner. And if you do, you might be able to find records for your people. So this is from the District of Columbia, Freedom and Slavery Documents in the District of Columbia. And this is the type of information. This is Harriet and Venus and her children, Anne, Betty, Matilda, Henry, and Gustavus. And there was a bill of sale on the 29th of March, 1822. John Abbott was indebted to the Bank of Columbia because he borrowed money to purchase these enslaved people. And if he fails to pay the note, then basically the people that he owes money to can seize the slaves and sell them, is what it's telling you. But as I mentioned before, every African American before the Civil War was not enslaved. There were a substantial number of free people. Now, they tended to congregate in certain places, primarily places like Savannah or Charleston, Richmond, Baltimore. They were generally places that were tolerated there because they typically had some kind of skill that was useful to the white population. New Orleans is another place, Natchez, St. Louis. But in these places, they're typically, life wasn't perfect for them either. In this case, this is Savannah, Georgia Register of Free Persons of Color. So it gives the individual's name, the residence, their occupation. This man was a butcher. Property owned. So he was a landowner in the city of Savannah. And yet he still had to have a white guardian who was going to make sure he stayed in line. We had the same thing here in St. Louis County. This is the free Negro licenses. This is the case of William Narcisse, a free mulatto man aged about 23 years, very light mulatto complexion, 5 feet 9.5 inches. It describes him. He's the class of free person of color who may be licensed to reside in this state. He's of good character, and he had to pay a bond of $400 to get this license. Now think what $400 was worth in the 1860s. I mean, I wouldn't want to have to come up with $400 just to live here now. But it was a lot more money that he had to pay then. Why would he pay it? He may have had a wife and children, maybe who were enslaved in the state. He may have had other family. This may be where his job was. But he had to pay a license fee, and a pretty substantial one, to be allowed to stay in the state. Something else to look at is state slavery statutes. And this covers all the laws passed by states covering the issue of slavery in some form or fashion. So there's a printed guide and microfiche. And it covers two things. It covers public law. And when we think of law generally, this is what we think of. This is the law that applies to everybody. It's, you're not allowed to kill people. You're not allowed to rob banks. The speed limit on Lindbergh Boulevard is 40 miles an hour. The speed limit on the I-70 is 55. Things like that. It covers everybody. It applies to everybody. And some of that is included. Here's an example. It's an act to prevent certain Negroes and mulattoes from migrating or remaining in this state. And it gives me a link, and I can go to the microfilm and understand this. And so this has to do with people that were freed from the Emancipation Proclamation. It was like, don't be coming to Kentucky, just stay out. But there's another type of law that's called private law. And this is where the best information from a genealogical perspective is going to be in here. Private law is a law passed by the legislature, or could be passed by the federal government too, but in this case, it's the legislature of the state, to cover one specific person for one specific situation. Usually it's a situation that if the law was applied as it's originally written, the outcome would be so ridiculous and so egregious that the legislature itself thinks it's horrendous and they have to do something about it. So we're going to look at this one. It's for Ben Stokes, a slave. And it pushes me down. It tells me this was in 1863 in December. And over there, an act for the benefit of Ben Stokes of Mason County. It's on page 268 and 269. That takes me to the microfilm. I just need to find it. Go to the microfilm, and this is what I found. It's in the General Assembly of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And on these pages, and it splits the two pages, so we get all this. Well, we're not going to read through this whole thing. Let me just distill it. So Ben Stokes was an old slave. He purchased land with the earnings of his own labor and conveyed it to his wife, Millie Stokes, whom he had previously purchased and manumitted. Millie died without legal heirs capable of inheriting the property, so the property reverted to the state of Kentucky. The General Assembly enacted to vest the land in a Benjamin F. Thomas to hold and use for the benefit of Ben Stokes. So there's a little bit to unpack here. So we know Ben Stokes is a slave, and he was able to earn some money from his own labor on the side. You know, the slave owner let him do that. And apparently the first thing he bought was the freedom for his wife. Now, you probably know the answer to this, but let me ask you anyway. Why would he free his wife before he freed himself? And the answer is, if he freed his wife and they had any other children together, then the children would be born free, because the status of the child was that of the status of the mother, which means it was much more important for the mother to be free than for the father to be free. So he purchased his wife from her slave owner and set her free. Unfortunately, before they had any legal heirs, she died. Does that mean they didn't have any children? No. They might have had children that were still enslaved, but enslaved people weren't allowed to own property, and so they couldn't inherit it. Ben couldn't inherit it because he was enslaved. And because of that, the property was going to go back to belong to the state of Kentucky. Now, under ordinary circumstances, if someone dies and they have no children and they have no siblings and they have no one else for the land to go to, it's got to go somewhere. And it makes perfect sense for it to go to the state, and then they can sell it and somebody else can make use of the land. In this case, the outcome was so egregious and so crazy and so wrong that even the state of Kentucky in 1863 thought it was ridiculous. And so they came up with this other plan that they're going to put the land in the ownership of Benjamin Thomas, whoever that might be, and it's entirely possible he was Ben Stokes' slave owner, or he could have been somebody else. I don't know. But he was somebody, and his job was to hold on to that land and use it for the benefit of Ben Stokes. So crops that were grown on it, whatever, would go to the money would go to Ben Stokes. So that's the kind of thing a private law can cover. And it's worth looking in these books to find out these kind of things, because you just never know. Another source of information is the records of antebellum Southern plantations. This is a huge, huge, huge microfilm set. We only have a very small portion of it. It is made as microfilms of records of slave-owning families from the South that are stored in various archives. And these archives might be places like Duke University or Tulane University or LSU or the Mississippi State Archives. And so this set of books is a great index to it. In this case, it's by the slave-owning family, so you have to know that. In this case, it's the Robert J. Turnbull papers. He died in Issaquah County, Mississippi, but he also had property in Louisiana. Basically, he owned a number of cotton estates, including Lakeside, Hopedale, Riverdale, and Hollywood plantations. And so basically this is the will and probate papers from when he died. So this is one of the ones we do have on microfilm here. And among this is the list of slaves by plantation. And it gives the people's names, and they're grouped by family. So in this case, you've got child Benjamin as the child of Flora and Big Lawrence. Now, if you go to our webpage for history and genealogy, and you go to an online database, online genealogy resources, and you scroll down, you'll eventually get to History Vault, Southern Life and Slavery in the Civil War, 1 and 2. This is what it looks like, and it contains 2 record sets: the records of the antebellum Southern plantation from the Revolution through the Civil War, and the records of antebellum Southern plantations from emancipation through the Great Migration. So lots and lots of records of these slave-owning families that have been donated to archives, have been digitized now, and they're on this website. It's not the complete set, but it's a lot of them. If you want to learn more, you're going to have to take the 4th class, Tracing Your African American Ancestors to Records of Slave-Owning Families, and I have no idea when we're going to offer that. Probably February, probably not before then. Another resource to look at is a court and legislative court and legislature petitions. These are petitions either to the courts or to the legislatures of southern states involving African Americans, either or in some form or fashion. So these books are indexed by states, and generally it's the slave owning family again. So this is from Mississippi. It's Julia Ami. And if I look through the book, I can find out that this case is going to be on Reel 18. It's number 28. And basically this happened in Lowndes County, Mississippi. Thomas Christian, the guardian of the minor children of Sarah Mee estate, asked the court to appoint commissioners to divide and distribute the estate's slaves among the heirs. It states that she died possessed of 41 slaves, and 6 were sold to pay the debts, and 2 died. There's 33, and these slaves need to be split up among the kids, probably because some of them were getting old enough to inherit. Now, when I go to the microfilm to look at this, then there's a petition cover sheet, but then there's a multi-page document. And included in this is a list of all the people that they're talking about in this lawsuit and their age. This could be potentially a goldmine of information. You should also be aware of the Hartman manuscript collection. This was a collection of documents that were kind of randomly connected by, I believe his name was David Hartman, who was a Mississippi bookseller and a white man. And much to the horror of his family and friends, he became interested in collecting documents related to African-American life in the antebellum South. And he would just buy everything he could. And when he died, they didn't know what to do with it. So they sold it. Xavier University owns the largest part of it, and some others belongs to Texas Southern in Houston. So the Xavier part, there's a guidebook, and it tells you the documents that are in it. In this case, it's a renegotiation of a mortgage on the sugar plantation and 50 slaves of Winslow Hatch, located in Terrebonne Parish with Labrador and Charpentier at New Orleans on April the 4th, 1860. So it's an 8-page document. And we're going to look through it. Well, if you're going to take out a mortgage, you have to describe what it is. In this case, it's the enslaved people on the plantation in addition to the plantation. And so they provide the names. And in the case of a mother with children, it lists the children she has as well. Another resource from this time period is a set of books called No Land, Only Slaves. And the authors went through a number of counties and parishes in Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. And they went through the deed records. And they didn't extract any information if it was a sale of real estate, but if an enslaved person's sale was recorded in the deed books, they copied it down into these books. So this is what it looks like. Here's an example. This is from Louisiana, Bienville Parish, Book B, page 666. Somebody Chafee, John Chafee of Claiborne Parish, to James Rochester, a bill of sale of a man named Pete for $800. You also want to look for wills from this time frame. This is from Beaufort County, North Carolina. And this is the will of Robert Williams. And like all the wills, it sounds pretty high and mighty. I, in the name of God, amen. I, Robert Williams of Beaufort County, in the state of North Carolina, blah, blah, blah. I give, for his wife, he's giving her 4 Negroes, namely Dinah, Tony, and Grace. And I love this because apparently he just wasn't good at counting. Or the reality is they probably left a name out when they transcribed it, but I like to think that he just couldn't count that high. What kind of other records might you find out there in the universe? It depends. You can find all sorts of things, though. Here's a journal article. Genealogical societies and historical societies all over this country publish usually once a quarter some kind of magazine or publication, and every kind of article that you could imagine is in it. This is from Somerset County, New Jersey, and it's manumissions of slaves in Somerset County. Now, does it surprise you that there were enslaved people in New Jersey? It does surprise a lot of people. And the thing that even surprises them more is when I tell them that it was actually the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that abolished slavery that freed the last slaves in the state of New Jersey. But this is a list of people who were freed by the slave owners fairly early on, 1805 to 1815. And if you want to learn more about digging into these journal articles, take our Advanced Techniques for African American Research. Again, I don't know when this is going to be offered, but my best guess would be sometime in February. We want to look at the oral tradition too. Stories get passed down through families, but sometimes they don't. And we have this whole series of books called The American Slave. These were put together during the Works Progress Administration. They needed things for people to do, and they sent people that knew how to write out to interview people who had been enslaved and were still alive. Now, it didn't matter who they interviewed or what they actually said. When they wrote these, they wrote them in an extremely racist manner. It's the only way I can say it. They wanted the people giving the stories to sound like they had been slaves, and so that's the way they wrote it. Probably the people didn't talk this way. Even if they normally talk this way, they probably did a code shift and when they were being interviewed. But that's the way it's written. And it's frustrating to read it sometimes, but it's got good information if you can find some of your people in there. You might find some church histories. This one is from the Olive Chapel. It's got all kinds of pictures of people, history of the church, names of members, great information. Voter registrations. This is from North Carolina in 1867. It's just a transcription and an index. But it gives the person's name, whether their registration was accepted or not, the county and the precinct, and their race. We have these for St. Louis City too. It's got the person's residence, their name, their signature, where they were born, their race, the term of residence in the precinct, the city, and the state, their age, their occupation, and the date of the application to be registered. And we've got them 1896 to 1936, so it's pretty long range. You might also, in a lot of cases, discover that you need to go to the source. And that could be a courthouse somewhere. Talk to them before you show up. Be polite as possible with the people. They have jobs to do, and their job is not to help us do our research. But usually, if we go in there with a positive attitude, they'll usually help us get to the records and let us have outlook to look at them. Another place is the archives. This photo is from the Mississippi State Archives in Jackson. The archives' job is to keep records of the state. And again, lots of records. All archives have their own rules, what you can bring in. Some don't let you bring in anything, any ink pen, but you can bring in a pencil. Some of them make you wear gloves while you're in there. But you're handling old and fragile documents in many cases, so they want to protect them. Now I want to look at another family. This is the Smithers and Jacobs family of Alabama, and we'll go through a bunch of weird resources on this one, and yet it tells a pretty amazing story. So Ruth Smithers was somebody I was working on for somebody, and her father was James A. Smithers. And he was born the 22nd of April, 1846 in New Hope, Madison County, Alabama, and he died on the 21st of September, 1927 in Paint Rock, Jackson County, Alabama. Two counties are right next to each other. Well, I went through one of our databases because one of the stories that this family had is that they had some Native American ancestry. And so there are some Native American resources on Fold 3, and I thought I'm going to have a look at this. And so there was this Eastern Cherokee application. So I looked into it, and what do you know? James Smithers applied to be enrolled as a member of the Eastern Cherokee tribe. He was rejected. Now, does the fact that he was rejected mean he's not native, has no Native American blood? No. It means he couldn't prove it. And the reason he couldn't prove it is couldn't prove any ancestor was ever enrolled. No ancestor was a party to the treaties, and he shows no connection with the Eastern Cherokee. So he was rejected from this. It means he probably isn't Cherokee, but that doesn't mean he's not Native American, doesn't have some Native American ancestry. There's all kinds of other Native American bands. But he had to put in the application. And look at all this information in here. Information about himself. Information about his kids. Information about his brothers and sisters. And his parents and grandparents. And this wonderful letter that you can't read. And so I'm going to extract it a little bit. My name is James A. Smithers. I live at Paint Rock, Alabama. I was born in 1846 in Madison County, and I claim Indian blood through both my mother and my father. I never had an owner. My mother was not a slave of Indian or white people. My parents and I have always been recognized as Negroes with Indian blood. We have always been free. My mother and father were not grown when they came down here to this country. My grandparents came down here before the Indians went away. So they were very early settlers in this area. They thought they had some native blood. Probably when this law was passed that people could apply, my guess would be some lawyer showed up and said, you know, I hear you might be part Indian. You think you're Cherokee? We can apply. And then of course the lawyer gets his fee, and they fill out a lot of papers. And the papers are still around for us to look at and give us the information, and that's wonderful. So let's look at this. Her mother was of Ruth Smithers was Julia Jacobs. Don't have a whole lot of information on her. She was born about 1859 in Alabama. Don't know when she died. Can't find it. But her father was Burl Jacobs. And he shows up in 1860. The fact that he shows up in the 1850 census indicates he was a free person in 1860. And Julia's listed there as his daughter. Parents are Burl and Betsy, and they're from South Carolina. And I'm going to put down the children's names. They're a little hard to read, and I'm going to want to go back to them, so I'm going to type them out. Nancy, Amanda, Mary, Isaac, Risey, Matilda, George, Burl, Julia, Betty, and Laura. Well, I want to look a little bit into Burl's history and see where it takes me. So I know from that he was born about 1801 in South Carolina. And I found a marriage record for him. He's married on the 20th of December, 1846 in Madison County, Alabama. So let's go backwards and see if we can find him in the 1850 census, and I could. Now, I don't have all these names because some of them weren't born yet in 1850, but we picked up two more, John and Daniel. So I went back to 1840. And there he is. Now, the 1840 census doesn't list everybody by name. It only lists them as tick marks in whatever category they're under. And these people were under free people of color. And so there was one male, 24 to 35. My guess that would be Burrell. Two females under 10, and one female, 11 to 24. That's probably his wife. And if you look, the person living next door to them was George Smithers. So that family was also free as far back at least as 1840. Well, this is 1830, and it's the same kind of deal. Listed as free people of color, just one male and one female. So if they're that long, and with the story that we've heard, that did they own land? Well, we have a series of books, and that database I showed you is based on these books. But it's Family Maps of Madison County. And if I look through the books, I can find that Burrell owned 80 acres of land that he patented from the federal government in 1858. And I can, in fact, get a copy of this land patent. He's the first person to ever own this particular 80 acres. Now, Googling around, I found this other thing, the Jordan Jacobs Cemetery Summary Report. And it was, of all things, on a website of the Army Corps of Engineers. So what the heck's going on? Well, it turns out the land they owned and the land they lived on became part of the Redstone Arsenal outside of Huntsville. And so when the military took it over, they did a survey of all the land to find all the cemeteries before they would do anything. They wanted to know where the cemeteries were so they could work around it. So among these records was this probate court record for Burrell Jacobs, and it's from the October term of 1873. Well, what does that mean? If they filed probate records in October of 1873, he had to have been dead before then, but not long before then. Because you file probate papers when somebody dies, and it's to split up their estate if there's no will. But there's other papers there too. And they did some research, and they think that Burrell Jacobs was born about 1810 in South Carolina, died in Alabama, and there were a number of Jacobs family, along with his siblings and his mother, came there. And he was enumerated among these other families, also from South Carolina. So they think they probably came from the Fairfield district of South Carolina. And most of them are buried in this Jordan Jacobs Cemetery. Well, that means I need to move back to South Carolina. And I'm going to start looking, and there are some Jacobs families in South Carolina. There's some in Richmond County. There's a William, a Zacharias, a Benjamin, and a Patsy. And if I go back to 1810, there's a John, a Ben, an Isaac, a Zach, a William, and a Nancy. In fact, if I go back to 1790, there's a Benjamin, an Isaac, and another Benjamin listed. And also a Zachariah, a Burrell, and a John. Well, this is interesting to me because if I look at these names, there's an Isaac that was among Burrell's children, Burrell, of course, John. So how do we find more information about him, about Burrell? Well, we know he died about 1873 in Alabama. We know all this stuff. I think his father was John Jacobs. Why do I think that? Well, I looked in the 1830 census. And in Madison County, Alabama, there were 3 men listed in the free people of color, Burrell, John, and Isaac. And that's their information about their families. We'll make it a little bit bigger and put it together so we can look at it. Now, when I looked in South Carolina, there were 3 other ones. So potentially any of these men could be his father, but we're going to rule some out right away. John is too young. The oldest male in his house is between 20 and 24. Burrell is older than that. Can't be his father. We're going to rule out Burrell too. Why? Because he can't be his own father. That leaves us with 4. John, Isaac, William, and Zach. So which one of these is his father? I already told you, I think it's John. But we've got 4 possible fathers. We've got to rule them out. So if we look at 1840 census, Fanny, who is his mother, is listed as head of the household, which means Fanny's husband is dead. So any of those men that are in the 1840 census can't be Fanny's husband because she'd be a part of their household if she was. Well, Isaac is listed as the head of a separate household, so clearly Isaac is out. John's not listed anywhere, so probably he's deceased. William's not listed in the census, and Zach's not listed. So we can rule out Isaac. Now, there's a series of books called Free African Americans of North Carolina, Virginia, and South Carolina. And if we look through it, we can find information about this family. And there was a Zachariah Jacobs born on the 4th of October, 1753. Well, we know it's not him. And the reason we know it's not him, you can't tell from this because I messed this up. But he had a different wife, a wife named Sally, and we know Burrell's mother was Fanny. So that rules him out. And I'm just going to rule out the South Carolina one because John was known to be in Alabama. It makes much more sense that his father would be in Alabama since his mother was. That leaves us with John. So we know John was born sometime between 1731 and 1775 in either North or South Carolina, and he died before 1840, and we know that because he's not in the 1840 census. Well, let's go to this book. And there's a John who's the head of a Newberry District, South Carolina household of 6 other free in 1800, and a Richland District household of 8 other free in 1810. That John is the son of Isaac, born about 1705, was taxable in Northampton County, Virginia, in the household of his father. His father was Daniel. So we know Isaac is the father, and we know Daniel would be the grandfather of Burrell, born about 1670 in Northampton County, Virginia. He sued a guy for a debt of money and tobacco. There's lots of records of him. And you notice Daniel is the name of one of Burrell's kids. So again, these names get passed down. Sometimes they're common like John and it doesn't help us. Sometimes they're a little bit more unusual, and that's a good thing. Well, if we look for more information about Daniel, we can finally work up to this and determine that he was the son, born about 1670, of Gabriel and his wife Bap. So we've taken this family back into the 1600s by being a little bit curious and by digging in through some of these more obscure records. So this is the end of this talk. We're in a position now certainly to answer your questions. If you do have something after the fact that you need to get in touch with us about, you can contact us. Our telephone number is on the screen, 314-994-3300. And you can email us at genealogy@slcl.org.
Okay. Dan, why don't you go ahead and leave that slide with the contact information up.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so first we do have some comments in the chat. Says, I am researching Yazoo, Mississippi. This is a great Zoom call. I have found relatives in DeKalb, Mississippi. There's a question about whether this presentation was being recorded. It is being recorded and it will be available later on the library's website and also on the library's YouTube channel. And let me see. Okay, so as to questions. What if your ancestors were Black, Native American, enslaved, and not of African descent who was enslaved? What would that be documented?
Anyone, there should be documentation of it. Most likely it would be in the records of the slave owning family, if you know who the slave owners were. You know, most of these plantations were large enterprises and they kept really detailed records. People born, people dying, moving people around from one to another if the family owned more than one. So there would be that kind of records. There should be records of them, again, probably without the name in the slave schedules. I mean, post-emancipation, they should appear in the census like everybody else. You know, technically it was illegal to enslave Native Americans, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Okay, if we need genealogy assistance, who can we contact? You can certainly contact us here at the History and Genealogy Department. Contact information should be up on your screen. Where can we locate World War II and Civil War pension files besides NARA in DC?
Civil War, there are indexes on Ancestry, and there are indexes on Fold 3, and some of the widows' pensions are digitized on Fold 3, but otherwise it's a matter of contacting NARA in DC to get them. For World War II records, to the extent that they weren't destroyed in the fire at the Record Center up on Page back in the 70s, they should be at the National Archives here in St. Louis. Again, part of the problem with that is with all the archives, it's hard to get into right now, and because of the pandemic.
If I can find contact for the Record Center, I will put it up in the chat. Thanks so much for all this fantastic information. Can you repeat the place to find Mississippi death certificates?
That's on a roll of microfilm here in our department, and to get the index, and the actual death certificates from Mississippi can be obtained from the Mississippi State Archives in Jackson. And I assume they have an index there that they could probably look it up. But if you want to shoot us an email, we can look it up, and it'd be easier to be able to give them the actual number of the certificate.
Okay. Okay, that's all the questions that are in the queue. Does anybody have any questions? Go ahead and type them into the Q&A. And this is your opportunity to get them answered right away.
I'm showing 18 things in the chat too.
Yeah, I've gone through chat. gone through the comments on the chat, and I think I've hit all the questions I found in there. I did post the link to the National Archives Personnel Records Center to where you would request World War II records in the chat. So that link should be in there. Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and close. I will pause right before we end the session just to see if there are any other questions, but we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. So thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the class and that you found the information to be useful for your research. If you have further questions or comments, please feel free to contact History and Genealogy at 314-994-3300 or by email at genealogy@slcl.org. And that information should be up on your screen. If you are watching this live, I remind you that this class has been recorded and will be available on the library's website at www.slcl.org/genealogy and the library's YouTube channel. If you are watching this on YouTube, we invite you to like this video and post a comment below. So let's see. Okay, one more question. How can I find death certificates that are not showing up for a family member in the 1940s?
It depends on the state. Most states from that long ago, you can probably get it with not too much difficulty. You might need to be a family member or in a prescribed class. If it's Missouri, it should be on Missouri Digital Heritage. One of the other states, I would contact the Vital Records Office of the state. It might be called something like the health. They might have it under the health department of the state or under the health and senior services or something like that. You might also try the state archives. It depends on the state law where they keep them.
Okay, and I will put the link to the Missouri death certificates in the chat. Okay. Okay, I believe that's all the questions we have right now. If you do think of some later, do feel free to contact us and we'll try to help you out. So I'm going to go ahead and end the Zoom call. And thank you everybody for attending this class tonight. Have a good evening and stay safe out there.
Thanks for coming.